All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, The Secret Ingredient to Getting a Better Website. Hint, it's not a bigger budget. I'm Meredith Esquivel, Digital Marketing Whaler at Whole Whale, a digital agency that leverages data and technology to increase the impact of nonprofits. I'm joined today by Ann Wen, Design Whaler and Head of New York, as well as Rose Liebman, Vice President of Accounts at Advomatic. Before we get started, I'd like to note that we will be recording the webinar and sharing the recording, the deck, and additional resources over email, so keep an eye on your inbox. Also, be sure to share any questions you have in the chat box throughout the webinar, and we will have time for Q&A at the end. With that, I will pass the mic over to Rose.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Whole Whale, for having me. I love talking about this topic, so I'm very excited to get started with this webinar. Just wanted to give you a little sense of who Advomatic is. We are a web development agency. We build websites for advocacy groups, labor unions, educational and government institutions. And we like to call ourselves a small but mighty team. We're committed to giving open source tools to mission-driven organizations to help them innovate and create a better future for all of us. So let's get started. So today, we're going to talk mostly about what to do to get the most out of your website project. But before we do that, in order to make sure that we get the most out of that discussion, we're going to talk about how to think about your project first. So website projects can feel overwhelming, especially in that moment before you've begun putting the whole process in motion. You kind of don't know where to start. So here's some guiding principles to help you get organized and manage your project well. These are more sort of like mindset things that will help you get into the mind frame that you need to be to make the right moves. So an important skill, maybe the most important skill you'll have in overseeing a web project, is to have the ability to prioritize effectively. So it is really true that when everything is important, nothing is important. Being willing and able to prioritize, and by extension, being willing to let go of less important features on your site in the service of building the most important ones and having a site that's functional and high quality, it will result in a higher quality site with a much longer shelf life. Excuse me. The next thing to try to do is to try to be transparent. So it's a partnership. Giving transparency, in order to get transparency, you need to give transparency. So this is true for all aspects of your project, especially true where the budget is concerned. We can talk about that a little more later. I would say just don't make your prospective vendor guess what your budget range is. Be honest about your resources, about your capacity. It's possible to get a high quality and useful website at almost any price point. The trick is to work together with your vendor to make a plan based on a real world target budget, not just a guess. And we'll talk about that again, as I said later. Be well prepared, but don't be over prepared. Sometimes people will waste cycles on preparing. We see this all the time at Advomatic. Organizations put together a lengthy, overly prescriptive RFP that can cause confusion, and it consumes valuable time on both sides. There are more efficient and effective ways to do your due diligence when you're picking a vendor. I understand sort of where that's coming from, but I'm going to propose a few different techniques for choosing a vendor that are a little more lightweight and that are actually more effective. Make sure that you're putting what you know about your organizational digital strategy together. We'll get into more of that a little bit later. But for now, let's just put a bookmark on that. And then the last thing is to take a long view. So we'd already talked about sort of ditching the big fat RFP. Also ditch the high stakes all or nothing mindset. Like that's sort of the kiss of death for website projects, for the success of a website project. Make sure that you're not putting too much pressure on this one project in this one moment in time. It may be a bit hard to hear this because a lot of times the project seems like the time that we're going to resolve all of our issues, but it's important to understand that a single website project can only take you so far. If you have that mind frame, you're going to be set up for more success. It might take you a little bit longer. So try to manage your budget and your energy accordingly. I would say reserve like 15 to 20% of your website budget for ongoing website support. And again, we'll touch on that later. It'll ensure the longevity of your site, and it'll alleviate some of the pressure that you feel to get everything right and knowing everything in advance. Because let's be honest, you can't know everything in advance. You'd basically just be guessing. A lot of what we try to do is get people to build something small and then get user feedback and listen and refine based on that sort of really vital conversation with your users. If you're going to do it all in your big project, you're going to lose that opportunity. And also then having the ability to make changes or add refinements later is really, really important. And then, of course, the final thing is if you've chosen the right vendor and we've done all the work to get a solid partnership, then be a partner. In a healthy partnership, you'll be managing project scope, stakeholder expectations, budget, and also a fair amount of uncertainty together with your partner. That's a lot. So the good news is that when that works, it's really a beautiful thing, and you really feel like you have somebody to rely on and who can support you. But in order to make it work, both sides really need to be able to do their part. We'll, again, touch on all of these things a little bit more further downstream. So now that we have our proper mindset in place, I want to kind of dig into what we think the most effective approaches to find a vendor are. And I'm going to break it down in before, during selection, and after selection. So let's start with before. The time for selecting a vendor is the time to also get organized and to get a rough consensus in-house. There are really great there's a kind of an interesting organizational dance that happens around the project there's a lot of clarity that sort of emerges. Take advantage of that moment when you're preparing to choose a vendor and embark on your project to really try, maybe not on every level of detail, but like on a high level, have a rough consensus among your stakeholders. So at this point, you should know in detail what your website needs to accomplish, and know that in the context of your organizational strategy. So that's the most important thing that you can bring to the table and for you to clarify at this point. Next, the sort of main output of this before choosing a vendor phase is to have a project brief. And I know some people like to call it an RFP, but we have some issues with RFPs, and I'll get plenty into that in the process of talking about vendor selection. But what we recommend is to write a short brief that includes an outline of your mission and your organization, an outline of your organizational and digital strategy as you understand it in the moment. We know that it changes. None of this stuff is static. An outline of your team's size and capacity, and we'll get more into that later. And a clear and well-prioritized list of requirements, again, subject to change. None of these things are static, but you can at least start with a list as best you can. And then finally, your budget. And we talked a little bit about transparency. We'll talk more about that later. As we said, ditch the overly complicated, rule-laden RFP, and I'll demonstrate why in a little bit. I'm going to recommend that you consider what's called an RFI process. You may have heard of it, you may not, but I'll explain what it is a little bit later. So as you gather your team together, make sure to do one very important thing, which is assign a single point of contact, who will run the selection process, but also be the main point of contact for the project. If you have to decouple those and you have to have somebody who's doing the vendor selection and then the main point of contact will be someone else, that's fine. Just make sure that those two people are working together. And a huge risk factor to be aware of is team capacity. We see this all the time. It's important to be brutally honest about your real life team capacity. We often see small teams of really smart, principled people setting themselves up for frustration and a sense of failure by employing an outsized digital and communications plan. You can have an ambitious communications plan. You just can't have it all at once. So make sure to triage and prioritize and grow your communications plan using the same guiding principles we talked about earlier. Prioritizing, triaging, having transparency, and also just being honest with yourself about what your real capacity is. It's not a failure. It's actually good strategic thinking. So during the vendor selection process, there are a few, again, guiding principles here. It's important for you to be willing to have a conversation or several with your prospective vendors. And I'm going to get into the RFI process momentarily, but you would like, if you were doing it a certain way, you wouldn't have a lot of vendors bidding. You'd only have a small set of vendors, 2 or 3, because you would have vetted them, you would have pre-vetted them. And I would say be willing and open to having a conversation with them, having an open door policy. There's been this unfortunate trend in the last, say, decade or so to issue these very, very impersonal, like heavy-duty RFPs and restrict conversations with vendors in order to create like what, quote unquote, a fair playing field. This is a complete fallacy. I feel very strongly about this because I work all the time with prospective clients, and I see all of the ways in which they get taken down by this. So fairness is definitely important, and I understand that. But even more important is being able to get that 360-degree feel for who you're partnering with to help you shape this like incredibly mission-critical communications tool. So leaving this to depend on, say, a paper proposal and a rehearsed presentation that's going to happen in a 2-hour time box with a bunch of stakeholders around is to infuse your vendor selection with a lot of risk. You really want to get them, catch them a little bit, not when they're rehearsed, when they're having to work stuff out with you, that you get a lot of really valuable information from those interactions, and you help to inform them well about what the project is. When you're speaking with your vendor, ask lots of questions and see how they respond. This is part of your due diligence. Like, do they explain things on your level? Are they talking over your head? Do they make you feel okay about your level of knowledge? Do they answer all of, you should answer all of their questions to the best of your abilities, but they should also be doing the same, right? Be willing to admit to the areas of uncertainty and see how they guide you, and get to know how they think, right? How they structure their process, how they resolve conflict. If you're paying attention in this process, you can really get a lot of very valuable information that can inform your decision and can also set expectations for what you'll be dealing with if you work with them. And this is a really important one because I think that sometimes people will go with a vendor who tells them what they want to hear. And there are a lot of people out there who are willing to do that, to just tell you what you want to hear, but be willing to hear inconvenient truths. I kind of feel like that speaks for itself, but I'll break it down. If someone tells you that some functionality that you're requesting or some set of functionality are not in your budget range and is making recommendations on how to manage that, positive, forward-thinking recommendations. Or if they tell you that, something that you're doing is going to result in a non-standard or not accessible site, be willing to listen to that. Be willing to sort of kill your darlings and listen to the experts and have them guide you on what is the best practice and the best way forward. Because downstream of this, when you're living with a site that you built for 3, 4, 5 years, you're going to wish that you listened to the more difficult conversations early on. If you find a vendor that you can trust, you should be able to let them tell you things that are sort of inconvenient for you to hear, but that are important. And then another one, and this is kind of a big one, it's sort of very important on both sides, is to avoid time wasters. So avoid time wasters, yours and theirs, right? The biggest time waster, you guessed it, I've already been on this for a bit, is the laden, opaque RFP process. We touched on this a little bit. I'd like to recommend that you consider using an RFI process. So in case you don't already know, and for those of you who do, just bear with me. An RFI stands for Request for Inquiry, and it's a shorter vetting process in which you circulate a brief set of questions and you cast a really wide net of vendors. And then you get the questions back, you review them, and you choose a subset of vendors, however many you want to, and you interview them. And just have a conversation, going back to this thing, be willing to have a conversation. You have a conversation with them, and you choose 2 or 3 of them, and then you have them make a proposal for you. Using that open door policy and getting to know how they think, trying to see whether they have that sort of like, this is not a word, but a more partnery approach, that's really what you're looking for. If you run an opaque process, you're going to get a lot of opacity in your process, and that is likely going to cause a lot of risk. There's already so much risk inherent in these projects. It's good to just mitigate as much as you can. So again, this is a risk mitigating mechanism, and it can help you employ early on in your project before it's even started, this methodology, this sort of like mindset. So that's it. So I would say just resist the temptation to create any kind of overly prescriptive vendor selection format. And so one final thought about this is that, and this is something that, kind of often goes unspoken, but it really is true, that the degree to which you create barriers to attracting great vendors is going to be reflected in the quality of the outcomes of your project. Most vendors are busy because they're excellent at what they do. And those are the people that you want to work with and that you want to attract. So if you're showing good faith in streamlining your selection process, you're inviting the best of the best, and you're clearing a path for them to sign up and have a really productive partnership with you. So during vendor selection, here are some qualities that you should look for in a vendor. And I feel like I've touched on them a little bit, but I'm going to go through them real quick here too, because I think it can't be emphasized enough, right? Choose someone who's proactive in guiding you, who's willing to explain things, and who's helpful and generous. Choose someone who has very high standards for quality. So beware of the vendor that says that they can cram a lot of functionality into a project for a fixed price. That's definitely a red flag. If you want to see your vendor vetting your budget and really making very specific and granular recommendations as to what they think you can accomplish with your resources. Again, choose someone who's willing to tell you the truth, even if it's not what you want to hear. Choose someone who's transparent in their processes. If you're running a transparent vendor selection process, they should be able to do the same, especially if you're going to be working with them with a fluid scope or with a time and materials contract. If you're doing this, you need frequent reporting. If you're going to do time and materials or fluid scope, you need to see frequent reporting on their part, on your progress, on risk, and on the budget burn down. And then finally, and this is important too, is just to look for somebody who can be a long-term partner, right? Make sure that they can support your site after it's built. I'll get into the importance of site support afterward, but you're really looking not for somebody who's going to come in and just build a site for you, but somebody who's going to be there for you, maybe, to different degrees over time, but someone who'll be there for you as a resource. And then finally, verify. Do your due diligence. Ask around. Don't just take their word for it that they're experts at X, Y, or Z thing. Check references. It's an easy and low-cost way to do your due diligence. Make sure that you know what you're getting into, because ultimately, a lot of these vendors have salespeople. I'm one myself, who might be a little bit unscrupulous. And I know that actually is what creates this environment where we have these laden RFPs and stuff like that, because there's a lack of trust. So just do your due diligence. You may trust your vendor. You may think you've picked the best vendor ever. Do your due diligence. You never know what you might find. After you have chosen your vendor, it's time to switch into partner mode. You've done all the hard work of choosing a vendor. Now you get into full-on partner mode. Be honest with your vendor, as you've done during your vendor selection process, right? About stuff that you don't know, and ask a lot of questions. A good partner will be there to guide you. And it's actually good information for the vendor too, to kind of get a sense of what your level of technical knowledge is, your level of sophistication around web development processes, because then they can tailor the way that they speak to you and make you feel really included. Be willing to negotiate around scope. Always opt for quality over quantity. I can't stress this enough. Be willing to sort of kill your darlings, as they say in publishing, right? You know that you want that one little thing, it's really exciting to you, but if that thing is going to come at the cost of this very vital piece of functionality that essentially is core to your mission, maybe just accept that you may have to do that further downstream. Always take a collaborative stance to solving difficult problems. Problems arise with web development. It's kind of an unwieldy animal, and placing blame or jumping to conclusions about who's at fault is not helpful. It's just better to gather all the facts and have a more of a dispassionate and collaborative stance. And then at the end is just understand that no process or team is perfect. And if you can keep an honest and respectful line of communication about that, when, not if frustrations arise, because it's a very stressful process, you'll be in a good position to smooth things out and make the project and the productivity of the collaboration, number one, keep it primary. Next, I want to jump into, choosing a CMS. So one of the things that you'll need to decide on early is what CMS you want to use. You should be able to do this on your own internally, for the most part, but there are some times when it's appropriate to get your vendor's advice on this. Like if you don't feel confident making this decision, if you don't really know properly how to answer things, if you just don't feel like you have the technical expertise, it's very appropriate for you to ask your vendor or your prospective vendor what they think about which CMS to use. But just make sure that you're verified, right? Since people tend to have a bias, and maybe they're not doing it maliciously, but they just have a bias towards CMSs that they know and like, they may recommend something that isn't right for you. So you need to be able to verify that. And here's some of the considerations around picking a CMS. There are more. My recommendation to you is just make a big old matrix, of all the considerations and the specific things to you as your organization, and have a very, again, dispassionate conversation with your stakeholders, do all of your information gathering, and just score them, Okay, so let's get started. So you'd want to know how much content you have and how frequently you'll be updating it, and whether it's static or dynamic. And for those of you who may not know what that means, it's basically the difference between just putting a one-off page or something that's actually drawing content from a database and showing it on different pages. How technical is your staff? That's really important. That sort of goes hand in hand with how frequently you are going to be updating your content. Do they really understand digital strategy, or are they sort of the accidental techies in your organization? That makes a big difference. You need to know that, because you need to choose a CMS that's extremely easy to use if you're going to have a staff that sort of weighs more on the less technical side. So open source or proprietary, like my answer and our answer at Avomatic, and the answer of most people in the nonprofit world is open source, 100%. There are lots of reasons why open source is the right choice for a nonprofit, but there are the outliers, and just make sure that you're not among them. Make sure that you at least consider the question of whether a proprietary CMS is right for you. Like I said, 99% of the time, open source is right for you because it's values aligned, it's less expensive, it's very well adopted. It just makes sense, but you never know. There could be some reason why your organization might want to opt for something proprietary. How scalable does your site need to be? Is your organization rapidly growing, or does it change, or is it constantly refining its strategic goals? You may then want to build something very simple, but on a highly scalable platform. Do you need the ability to spin up a new site, create new landing pages, campaigns, mini sites? How frequently? If you say once or twice a year, then that might not be a reason enough to weigh very heavily on your CMS choice, but it may. Does the site need to integrate with other systems? This is super important, and it really does inform your budget. Integrations can weigh very heavily on budgets, and they can oftentimes be very central to the organization's mission. So this is something to absolutely consider. What are the integrations you need? Do you have a CRM, a grants platform, a mapping system, some sort of external event system? Should anonymous visitors be able to create content? That's pretty self-explanatory, but that actually has a lot of implications for the kind of CMS that you choose, and the protections that you can have. You might need to be on a certain kind of CMS to be able to allow that in a safe way. Do you have any requirements around things like roles and permissions, content workflow, which is basically like so-and-so writes a draft, X, Y, and Z person read it and review it, and this person has the ability to publish. If you need to be passing something around using your CMS as opposed to a Google Doc, and you need that to be done in the CMS, then that's another consideration. And then, of course, there's media management. If you have a media-rich site, or you plan to grow into a more media-rich site, then you might want to consider that as part of just weight that a little bit more heavily in your choice. And then finally, your budget. What kind of a budget do you have available for your website build? But also, extremely importantly, and this is often overlooked with very heartbreaking results, is what budget do you have for continued site support? Site support is, as I said, often overlooked, but it is a vital part of your site management, and you need to be able to afford that. So I just did a webinar about a week ago on this very topic, and I can actually share that link in some follow-up email, but support is really a non-negotiable. If you want your site to have a longer useful life and you want it to serve your strategic goals, then you absolutely need to have a support account. Oh, I think we've got one slide that's a little out of order there. So next I want to talk about, sorry guys. Okay, so finally, which CMS is best for you. Things to consider, sort of in short, right? Ongoing technical maintenance, content administration, we just talked about, and your internal resources. That's sort of the triad of deciding which CMS is best. Once you've gathered all that information, you have that sort of large matrix, it really needs to come down to these three things. Next, I want to talk about how to communicate your vision to designers. This is something that comes up in like many blog posts have been written about how to talk to designers. And so designers, actually there's a specific way to communicate with them where you can get the most out of them. And this next section is really just about that. First, you have to start with sort of understanding the role of a designer, like where they sit in terms of their understanding and their perspective is the sort of overlap between what you require as an organization and what you want, what your users need, because sometimes they'll have a slightly different take on that, and that comes from years of experience, and good design, of course. So what I like to say is one of the great ways that you can prepare to speak with your designer is to take a show, don't tell approach. So designers are visual creatures. So in preparation for your work with a design team, make sure that you have lots of examples of designs that you think work and websites that you think work. And I use that word work very intentionally. It's not about what you like. It's not about your taste. It's about what works. It's about what works, what's functional and what's strategic. So be able to pick those and to articulate what you like about each one, how you feel that it works, right? And it's important also because some aspects of the examples of the visual work that you may show may not be easily articulated. So there's like the layer that you're saying that you think works, and there might be like another layer that the designer is getting a read on that may not be as easily articulated in language, but that's sort of visually giving them a sense of where they need to land. So having visuals is important to communicate in that way. And again, next is prioritizing. The best way to be supportive and collaborative with a designer is to be able to communicate sort of early and often what's critical and where your designers should spend time and invest their time, and conversely point out opportunities for sort of streamlining or reusing things to save on budget. There are lots of really great new practices for that in web design, creating lots of like modularity and reusability, and a good like up-to-date web designer is on board with that and is going to be able to advise you on that, on how to do that. And design, just like understand that design can weigh on a budget. So make sure that you're using all the tools that you have to get the most out of that time. And this is one of the ways that you can, is just really prioritizing and triaging and being there to say, yeah, this is super important, this is less important, this we can reuse, etc. That's how you can be really helpful. So give useful feedback. I have this like silly little example here, like, of how to give feedback. Like when you're giving feedback, try to use clear and specific and actionable language. Focus on the issue, not the solution. That's a big one. So getting to the solution is the designer's job. And this is, again, goes back to this overly prescriptive mode, right? If you're basically saying, make this copy bigger, you might be missing something. There might be something about the weight or the contrast that the designer can do. And when you're giving a very prescriptive piece of feedback, you're not allowing that suggestion to leave room for the possibility that the designer may have something more effective. If you must make a suggestion, do it in a way that's sort of lightweight and leaves the door open for exploration. And so here's like, of those three, here's the one that I think works best. It's just like the help text is hard to read. The sign up field is hard to read. Be willing to answer questions about that. Why is it hard to read? Well, it's a little light. I can't see it. There might be something that the designer comes back and asks you that will help illuminate that and will help them come up with a solution. And again, if you feel like you know what the solution is, share it, but just be willing to open your mind to other things. And then finally, back to this idea of trust. Trust your designer. Like once you've gone to the trouble of finding this person and doing your very like deep selection process. Just enjoy that. Enjoy that you're coming into this process prepared. Enjoy the energy that comes with creative process and really good collaboration. And you can do that by staying, as we said, in your swim lane, communicating effectively, and working with the designers to kind of clear the way to make the process really fruitful. And now I'm going to hand it over to Anne. Anne, let me know, and I'm just going to be like moving the slides forward to talk to you about maintaining SEO and functionality during a relaunch.
All right, Rose, I've really learned so much on this, and we're going to shift gears a little bit from Rose's very critical high-level approach when you are looking to redo your website, and think a bit about the smaller details for maintaining the SEO, the reputation that your current site already has built, and how to transfer that over to the new site so you're not starting from scratch. And next slide, please. I can see that there are quite a few of us in this webinar from New York, and you know that living in New York, we move all the time, so migrating a site is not very much different from moving. It is not very pleasant, but when planned well, the moving experience can be less painful. Same thing with the website. We can have more control over our destiny when we plan for the migration and the transfer so that we can avoid things like 404. When the new site is launched and a user could possibly be clicking on an old link to your site that lives elsewhere on the internet. So likewise, when you move from one location to another, you set up a mail forwarding service, you can do a lot of the same practice on your site. Next, please. We want to avoid 404s, but also try to have fun with it. There will be cases where your new users to your new site will land on a page that no longer exists. Have a message that make it seem like, whoops, you are looking for a tail that you don't have. This is our puppy whaler turtle, and she ran into a 404, and we try to have fun with it, but the goal is to have as few people as possible land on this page. Next, please. So there are certain parts of being a good partner for you to hold up your end of the bargain when launching a site. And there are two parts that we like to break down the aspect of maintaining SEO and functionality. One is pre-launch homework. There is quite a few steps that you can take before your new site goes live. So here are the 4 things, and not to get into many details, but I'll go into each of them very quickly in a rapid fire manner so that we can get through to all the things that one has to do. And next, please. All right, so the most important thing that you can do before a site launches is to plan a redirect. So for example, if you have a page, your donate page, the old URL on the old site was /donate, but on the new site, you want to move that to something else like donate-now. Make sure that you map out all of the existing URLs on your site, and then add a column in a spreadsheet that tells, denotes what the new destination will be. Because even though your site, the URL might be updated, there will still be links on other sites that link to your old site, or social media shares, and even Google crawl indexing that may lead people back to the old URL. So you want to make sure that if mail is being sent to your old address, that it is now being redirected to the new destination. And one technique that we tend to find to be the most productive and efficient in doing this is to export a list of all the pages on your site from Google Analytics. You can hit a button and then that'll export into CSV. And from there, a good and healthy exercise to go through that may be a bit tedious, but that will save you so much headache in the long run, is to tag the pages with, one, the most important thing is the new URL if there is one, and also keep, kill, or clean. Do all pages need to be migrated over, or are you only keeping a few? And if so, what is the new URL? This is by far the most important step. Next, please. And then the other piece that is very important, that is also in the background, not quite visible, is planning for Google Analytics or your web analytics migration. Because all of your analytics has custom configurations such as goals and events that needs to be mapped out so that when the new site is launched, those tracking is not lost. Next. Also important to keep the functionality and transfer with a seamless experience is to create an inventory of all the forms that you have on your site, because nonprofits, one of the most important ways for us to engage with your supporters is through forms, whether it be newsletter sign up or volunteer form or donation. So you need to make sure to create an inventory of all of those forms in your current site, and then also map out where the data for each of those forms is going and where they should go next. Because the last thing you want is for someone to raise a hand, support your organization, and then have their message be lost and without having anyone look at it. Next, please. Another item for you to do pre-launch is to set up Moz keywords. Moz is a tool that helps you maintain and monitor the SEO health of your site. So what we do before a site launch normally is to plug in all the keywords that are important to our nonprofits. So for example, a Donate Life America working with organ registration, the keywords that we would be plugging into Moz to monitor would be things around types of organ donation, lung donation, kidney donation, donation statistics and whatnot. And so that way you can begin to track and understand currently how your site is ranking for those keywords. And then once we launch, to look back at it to see if the ranking has improved. But this is pre-launch work. We need to set it up so that you can monitor with retroactive data. Next, please. Okay, so that was pre-launch. Now we have post-launch items. This is after your site has launched, after you've picked all the vendors and gone through the steps that Rose had walked through. Now you can see that this list is a bit long, and just to reiterate, there's a bit of homework here, but it'll save you so much headache in the long run. All right, let's run through these items. Next, please. So remember that spreadsheet that you created for mapping old and new URLs? This is where you can use plugins depending on which CMS you end up using. There will be modules or plugins that you can use to set up redirects very easily. So in this instance, this is a WordPress plugin called Quick Redirects, Quick 301 Redirects. On the left side, you see the old URL and then the destination. And then from here, whenever someone hits your old URL, they will be automatically taken to the new destination and avoid that 404. Next. Oh, here it is again. Once you launch the site, as careful as you are, there may still be some instances of pages where people are still landing on a 404 not found page. We recommend going to Search Console, which is a tool from Google that helps you monitor how your site is appearing in search results. And there is a tab called Coverage that shows you all the URL in the past specified date range where people are running into 404. So you can export that list and then set redirects for them to their appropriate page. Next, please. And then you should also check your configurations, the Google Analytics planning and the Search Console configuration that you had set up. You can, most importantly, update the sitemap. Sitemap is essentially a list of all the pages on your site that Google or search engines crawl to serve up in searches. And so it's very important that you have this updated, especially with a major site launch. And you can generate sitemaps using a plugin like a Yoast SEO. It'll spit out a link that you can automatically add into Search Console, and voila. Next, please. Another important thing is to make sure that your old site is no longer indexable by search engine. We want to do this because, first of all, if you just put so much work into the new site, we don't want users accidentally going into the old site. And also, this is to avoid duplicate content in the case of there are two sites live. So you can run your old site through a tool called RankSider. You can enter this here and submit just to make sure that the old site is no longer indexable. Next, please. Also important is to add custom meta descriptions. So these are the little bits of data that shows up in search and in social share posts that is very critical for search engines to understand what content your page is conveying. And you can use a plugin like a Yoast SEO where there are very easy plug and play bits, boxes where you can enter custom information. Next, please. Also very important, and this ties into SEO and user experience, is to perform a site speed audit. Your site may look beautiful, but we also need to make sure, especially with a rising mobile audience, that it loads quickly. Otherwise, you lose users for every second that the site takes longer to load. In this case, I just ran the whole website, and it looks like we've got some work to do. You can use a tool like a Pingdom or Google Page Speed Results to understand how fast and where are the areas to optimize site speed. Next, please. Similar to the meta description that we had just talked about earlier, you want to rescrape important pages on social media because Facebook and Twitter don't automatically rescrape the pages to understand which image to grab should someone share a certain page, or what title and what description to grab. So you can go back into a tool called Facebook Debugger or Twitter Card Validator to run a URL on your site through the tool, and then you can hit the button scrape again so that these different platforms have the most updated information on your critical pages. Next, please. And then lastly, don't forget after launch to continue to monitor your traffic. What normally happens in a site launch is on the top graph here, which is very beautifully drawn, you can see that with most site launches, what you'll notice is there will be a valley in traffic over time. During that launch, most sites will see a 30% dip in traffic, and that is not to worry unless the traffic does not recover within 1 to 3 months. And that is where you know that there is some indexing issue or some 404 issues that you have not resolved. But this valley, there's nothing to be alarmed about. But when you do your due diligence with all the homework steps that we had just talked about earlier, you can avoid this valley. So for instance, with all of our site launch, you see the graph right below. You want to see as though if you're looking at data traffic for your site, you can't tell when the site flip happened. And most importantly, traffic needs to grow. And so in order to avoid this valley, we highly recommend going through those steps to optimize SEO and maintain functionality. And I know that was a whole lot of items to do in a few minutes. That was rapid fire, so feel free to ask questions at the end. But for now, I'm going to turn it back to Rose for site security.
Thanks. Okay, so just in keeping with the sort of this a little bit more, task level type approach for the second half of this webinar, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to keep your site secure. So I've kind of, again, put it in 3 different buckets, right? The short term, the long term, and then the personal as well, which we'll get into shortly. So for short-term site security, these are the best practices for your most immediate things that you should be doing now, like this minute. So start with the easy things. I'd like to former employees have active logins on your site. That's an easy thing to fix. Does your system allow people to have obvious, simple, or short passwords? That's something that you could throw into your requirements in a project redesign and make sure it's a very small, like module or plugin, depending on which CMS you're using, to enforce more complicated passwords. Perform all recommended updates and apply security patches in a timely manner. You should be doing that now with your site. You should be doing it with your redesign site. You should be doing it forever and ever. It's very important and then very easy. Assign a clear owner or an individual on your team who is the sort of keeper or the shepherd of your website security. You need to have clear responsibility for that. And then vet your hosting setup. Make sure that you have a secure hosting platform with controlled development environments, and that you're covered in that way, because a lot of bad actors can compromise your site through the hosting platform. And then finally, get on HTTPS if you're not already on the entire site. Some sites will only have it on some pages. Make sure it's applied to every page. For the longer term, you need to just get a handle on what your level of risk is. Are you a target because of your organization's mission? Do you store user data, credit card information? That all puts you at risk. Has your development team performed a security audit at least once a year? If not, then you should make that a practice. Have like a real, your partner, whoever your vendor partner is, do a deep site audit and make sure that your security is in order. You're always going to turn up stuff that you can fix. And that leads me to the next one, which is fix things as they arise. So really resist the temptation to ignore what you find, because security issues will only remain invisible for so long. Then they will become highly visible and you'll have a big problem on your hands. So fix issues as they arrive. So now I want to talk a little bit about personal security. You may think, oh, well, personal security, what does that have to do with anything? Well, it has to do a lot. This is not just personal for you, it's personal for all your staff. Everyone in your organization should be using two-factor authentication when possible, and especially for things like your email or the organization's bank account. That's very important. And use a password manager. I was just about to say that, some people are sort of shy away from doing that because they'd have to, verify passwords and where's my password? Well, we have these amazing things now that are really taking hold and using these password managers. If you haven't heard of them, look into them. They'll prevent you from being caught in most types of phishing attacks if you're using them well. And if you don't remember your passwords, it's a really handy tool to have. Some of the big ones are named 1Password, LastPass, etc. And then finally, this is sort of the last bit of advice around personal security. And again, personal security is like, we say like the personal is the political, I'm not even sure what that was, but just what you do personally affects your organization. So make sure that your passwords are at least 11 characters long. So anything shorter is basically the same as no password at all. And that's all I have for you today. And I'm gonna pass it along to Anne. But I just want to say that if you have any questions, you can reach me at rose@evamatic.com. I know that we've covered a lot of ground here, and I'm happy to speak with you and answer any questions you have.
Cool. So we have time for a Q&A. We already have some questions trickling in, but please, there's plenty of time. So if you have questions on your mind, add them to the chat box and I'll ask them live. Our first question is, any resources or tips for moving to HTTPS?
Resources I don't have, but I can find. I don't have sort of on the fly right now. This is something that you would have to take up with a developer, and I am not a developer. I know we have developers on staff who would be able to answer that question. Specifically, I would say just get educated about it. I'll put a few resources. We have a few blog posts that we've written, and there are a few other resources that I could put in to a follow-up email that will help you get started understanding the issue of HTTPS.
Yeah, so depending on which host you use for your site in DNS registrar, there may be some built-in free HTTPS that is powered by, say that really fast. That is, what you need to get is an SSL certificate, security socket layer, and then from there use that certificate to enable HTTPS. For instance, Whole uses a tool called Cloudflare that offers that for free, and they do make the process of transitioning from HTTP to HTTPS a lot more seamless. I can add the link to that as well.
Another question we have is, how many designers do you recommend I request from a web designer or from a firm?
How many designs? I just want to see if I understand the question. How many design concepts?
I believe concepts or different iterations.
Yeah.
But Sarah, if you have more information, feel free to send it back into the chat.
So I'm going to just assume that it, for now, unless you hear back, interrupt me if it isn't, but I'll assume that it's, the question is how many design concepts. And there's actually a really great newer way of working with design concepts, and that's style tiles, a sort of a combination of what are called style tiles and mood boards, where aspects of the design are sort of sketched out and you're able to have a conversation about them. That saves a lot on resources, and it basically vets and takes away things that that are just unacceptable or don't work before a lot of time and effort is spent on it. So I would say start with a few style tiles, maybe 2 to 3 directions of style tiles and what we call mood boards to sort of show a look and feel, or like a sense of what the thing will look like without actually composing it. And then once you pick one direction, you can move on to larger designs.
Yep, I agree with Rose's approach, where I think the question is rather the number of iterations and not the number of designers. But I will say that if your design requires complexity, where there should be a different designer for user experience and a different designer for graphic design, that would warrant different designers. But in many cases, we have seen successful projects with just one designer who has worked very closely with a client, getting very rapid feedback for every single iteration.
Any thoughts on WordPress versus Drupal?
Yes, absolutely. There's a lot of information about that out there, and I can include some lengthier information about it, but essentially WordPress is better for, sort of down and dirty, is better for a less technical team, for content that's not as dynamic, that doesn't need to be segmented. If you have very complex databases of information, then Drupal is really something that you'd probably want to lean toward. WordPress is less expensive over the long term, but it's not as granular. It doesn't have as much fine control over many things, like, again, the management of content, management of permissions, several other things. If you have a very content-rich site, you can usually get better management and control over it with Drupal. I would say if you're a small to mid-size nonprofit, you should be looking at WordPress first as a default. Again, there's some caveats there. And if you're a mid to larger nonprofit, or if a lot of your work, it is highly, highly dependent on your website, then you might want to start with Drupal. But they're different, and they serve, they have a lot of overlap, but they also serve you differently depending on what your size and your mission is.
Both WordPress and Drupal in our experience are solid, and they are actually our CMS of choice because they're both open source, are very extensible in the sense that there are millions of developers out there who have put out plugins and modules that you can use for free instead of having to create from scratch for things like forms and sliders and whatnot to add to your site. I will say that when you're considering a CMS, another thing to think about is the author experience. It's not just about the user experience, but author experience for your staff. When you're writing a post, when you're updating content, what interface, what system will make it easier for your staff to maintain your site? And also on that end, WordPress is a lot easier to use. Although Drupal is, like Rose said, very powerful in terms of being able to display dynamic content. And WordPress is great. I mean, Drupal is great for if your nonprofit wants to have a logged in system to manage your members. WordPress can do that, but Drupal is way superior in that sense. But again, WordPress is a lot more author friendly. And for instance, the whole site is built on WordPress, but we have another nonprofit, Power Poetry, with 500,000 users that's on Drupal.
How long does it typically take to start and then finish a new website project? So building one from scratch.
I think that, unfortunately, the answer to that is going to be, it depends. I mean, for a small, simple, very straightforward site, it could be sort of 3 to 5 months. And we've worked on sites that have taken 18 months. Some have taken 2 years. It just depends. Another thing to think about is that you can do something what's called an MVP. We like to work with that. If you have some reason that you need to have your relaunch done by a certain time, we like to work with this MVP model, which is essentially stands for minimum viable product. That's a term that comes out of the software world, where we basically say, here's a small subset of requirements that we're going to have ready for this particular date. And it's going to be a much simpler site than you ultimately are going to have, but everything is going to work really well, and it's going to feel like a complete site. That's always a good way to go if you have a time frame constraint, then rather than trying to jam everything into a short time frame, which could really end up with a very low quality site.
It depends. It's the right and unsatisfactory answer. I agree with Rose there as well. We normally also see 3 to 6 months as the standard time range. And what I will note is that during those periods, we spend about 80% of that on the actual site build itself, including design and then development, and the other 20% on the pre-launch phases that we had mentioned earlier, on preparing the site for migration. And then towards the end, making sure that once the site is flipped, that it's not the end. You need to have training with the vendor so that your entire team knows how to update content and maintain the site.
What is the typical price range for a site rebuild for an organization that's not large and does not have a large budget? What can they expect?
Yeah, that's also a tough one, and that one is also it depends. There are a lot, and then I'm not trying to be silly here. It's just that Sometimes you don't have to do a big redesign. Sometimes you can do a refresh. There are ways, we're big proponents of like sort of taking that more iterative approach. You may not need to overhaul your site. That webinar that I was referring to that I did a few weeks ago was really very much about like when to iterate and when to overhaul. So if you're just in an iterative mode, you can work with a smaller budget. It's hard to pull out numbers because it's really on a case-by-case basis. It can range anywhere from, say, 15 or 20,000 all the way up to 400,000. So it's very hard to say.
And that's why being transparent with your budget is very important early on, like Rose has said earlier. And with any budget you have, there will be vendors in those range who can do a good job. And the most important thing is early on, making sure that you can hold hands and agree on the scope to which that you are building, because there is really no limit to how expensive site builds can be. We completely understand that. So being very clear about what you want to do with your budget, and then finding the vendor who can fulfill that. There will be give and take. There will be compromises that needs to be made. And so that's why the priority is just the most important thing when you have a set budget in mind.
And our last question, how do you set up your website to show categories in search engines? So for example, when it comes up in search, you'd see the main URL and then subcategories such as about us, contact us, mission, blog, etc.
I have a feeling Anna's going to have a much more satisfying answer to this question, so I'm gonna let you do that.
I will try. So when you want to have control over which links to display under this search results, this is called schema markup. So for your site, it's written in the code where there are different tags and syntax that Google and search engines have that is very standard, where you can code in which results you want to be displayed under the main category. And then you might also notice that on the graph, the open graph data on the right side, sometimes when you Google an organization, there will be a snippet on the right side of the page that shows you the summary of that organization. So you can also optimize using Search Console to optimize the display of those quick results. And I can follow up with some detailed resources on that as well.
Awesome. So that's all that we have time for today. But no worries, Rose shared her contact information, and we'll also share Whole as well. In the meantime, you can keep learning with WWU. We have a course on cybersecurity and on content marketing and SEO, both relevant